Anyway, let's get to business. So I am delighted to be here. There's a little clicker that's going to guide me through the couple of comments. What Bryan and I are going to do today is really give you a little bit of a walk through where this industry finds itself, or this sector finds itself, as we're mid-2016. Give or take $10 billion or more has been invested in the sector over the last many years, a proliferation of companies. Bryan and Venrock really represent one of the iconic venture funds, and Bryan is a really very, very diverse guy that runs everything from genomics to classical biopharmaceuticals to digital health and so on. So what we're going to try and do is just give you a quick walk through each of the sectors. I'm going to do a snapshot of companies in that sector, and then we'll highlight the ones where Bryan has been an investor, and we'll kind of go from there. So against that backdrop, let me just lay a few foundations that everyone knows well. So these are the Rock Health report, including the first quarter, which interestingly, people, as we ended 2015, we said, can this continue at this velocity? And yes, indeed, the first quarter was yet again a record-breaking quarter of funds coming into the sector. One of the things that I think drives those numbers is a very substantial amount of investment in the kind of $50 to $100 million tranche, so that will drive the numbers pretty dramatically. The companies across the bottom are ones last year that were in that category of sort of the giants. But similarly, there's a good number of Series A companies that are starting as well, and one of the things we'll talk about is, okay, Bryan, you've got this huge mass of companies that have already been started, funded, and are consuming capital. How do you pick your bets between what's existing and what you think is the next horizon? So against that backdrop, what we're seeing is that some of the exits that people were wondering, will they be there, are indeed presenting themselves. So we're seeing M&A on the rise. We're seeing companies get out with successful returns, and the public markets have been a little bit more crusty. Companies are getting public, but what's happening in the aftermarket is very much company specific. So what I've tried to do here, and this is a slide that I love the format, so you'll see it probably over and over when I show up places, but what I do is continually update it, is it just gives you a quick snapshot of the landscape. It gives companies that have raised 50 million, give or take, companies that have raised 100 million, and then the boxes on the far side of the slide are the ones that have really increased, the companies that have recently been acquired, and then the IPO candidates. So against that backdrop, as I sit down and get going with Bryan, I thought that we would try and frame our conversations around two basic questions. As we look at each of these sectors, what are the barriers and or accelerants to the tipping point? So for example, Bryan and I were just talking a little bit, my deep roots are in the early biopharmaceutical days. In fact, it shows my my long of tooth, but I remember being at the first H&Q meeting when Genentech announced TPA, so that's kind of where I go back. And then I got into the digital health world as one of the founders of the San Diego Cooley office 20 plus years ago, with the combination of Qualcomm as one of the public offerings going out at the time, and then four of the life science companies, biopharma companies. But what we were talking about is in our work that we've all done, or that both of us have done a lot of in the biopharmaceutical arena, that you're dealing with a pharmaceutical sector that has a lot of money, and they basically are trying to fill their pipeline, and they're willing to invest in that pipeline. In the digital health sector, it's a little different, because you either have the payers or the employers that, by definition, are working on very narrow margins, or you have the consumer world, which is obviously a great pool of resource, but historically it's been very difficult to get to, just because just consumer products have been tough and challenging. So that is just an example of the barriers and accelerants. And then the real question is, who is underwriting the transformation and why? So against that backdrop, let me go to our first category, which is health and wellness. I'll move over here with Bryan. But Bryan, before we start, and what I've done in my formatting here is the companies that are circled are companies that Bryan has been Bryan and or Venrock has been an investor in. But I thought before we started, why don't you just talk a little bit about kind of Venrock, your history as an investor, and
Sure. Thanks for having me. So Venrock's been around since the late 1960s. Started out as really the venture capital arm of the Rockefeller family, and since sort of 1980 or so has been invested pretty heavily in early stage businesses in both technology and healthcare. And I got to Venrock in the late 1990s, so I've been there almost 20 years, and have invested pretty broadly across the healthcare landscape. So the first couple of investments I made, one was a genomics business, Illumina, and the other was actually a healthcare IT business called Athena Health out in Boston. And at least my investing has continued to be, I guess that's schizophrenic, and varied over time. Certainly for the 1999 through probably 2010 timeframe, I would say that I and we as a firm were occasional and opportunistic investors in what I consider to be sort of the software-enabled services space in healthcare. And so that is really, businesses that are sort of technology-leveraged services businesses that are seeking to, find some arbitrage and improvement in the healthcare system. And so we did that for a little bit, and then with sort of the combination of the ACA and the recession, a bunch of the sort of underlying dynamics in the space changed for us. Lots more entrepreneurs coming in, some changes, some sort of seed changes in payment models and people's interest in the space. And so then we increased our investment pace in the space, and for the last 5 years have probably made 1 to 2 investments a year in the space, which is double or triple what we had been doing previously, primarily starting businesses with, well, I guess both the tech and healthcare boom over the last 4 or 5 years. For us, companies that had found product market fit felt a little expensive, so we went early and have essentially seeded or started most of the last 5 or 6 or 7 companies that we've gotten involved with across the landscape of what I would call healthcare IT, you guys would call digital health, something like that.
Got it. Great. So just to foreshadow the categories that we're going to talk about, so we'll talk broadly about health and wellness. We'll talk about companies that have in one way or another tried to improve clinical efficiency and clinical workflow, companies that have worked in one way or another to look at revenue cycles and revenue flow and efficiencies, and then finally telehealth. But Bryan, maybe, and I guess I'd also have to say that as the digital health as a sector began to be identified as a sector, I go back about 10 years, and again, I may be biased because of the work that I've done with Qualcomm, but I think Qualcomm, along with Leslie Saxon, who will be one of our speakers tomorrow from the Body Computing Center, and then from some of the early work at MIT, that kind of, for me, roughly dates when this moved from kind of health IT to digital health, if you will, and I think it kind of took prominence with Rock Health and people starting to identify and categorize 5 years ago. But what I would say is that there were really a very small cross-section of venture capital funds that were equipped with both the depth of understanding of the healthcare industries as well as depth of understanding in areas such as IT generally, software as a service, software analytics, and so on and so forth. And I think when we talk about Bryan Roberts as a legend, I think there's no question that Venrock is one of that small group of firms that saw the opportunity of the convergence. But before we get to our main topic, just given my history in San Diego and in particular genomics, San Diego, obviously, Illumina is iconic. Life Technologies, now Thermo Fisher. Fisher spent a fair bit of time, Craig Venter and what he's doing with HLI and the like. Broadly, the category of digital health is now claiming some of the things that are happening in genomics. I put Helix up as an example, which is a spin out of Illumina, $100 million of funding, and is a direct-to-consumer, at least a consumer-facing company. Just from the way within Venrock, when you think about sectors and which partners look at which deals and so on and so forth, would you sort of include the genomics groups, broadly speaking, or not?
Sure. The interesting thing to me about genomics for the healthcare system and the delivery of care, right, is that hopefully at some point we're going to understand enough biology because of all the genomics work that's being done that you can actually apply it clinically, right? And so you can apply that clinically in a wet lab sense, so molecular diagnostics, stuff like that, or you can apply it clinically in a big data sense. And that latter half, from a business model perspective and stuff like that, would, for me, fit within the digital health rubric.
Right. Good. So let's turn to our first kind of health and wellness. And if I go back to my early years working in the venture community, I found that most venture capitalists, probably a broad statement, that were coming out of the valley had a bit of an allergy to sort of direct consumer-facing businesses. They were expensive markets to access, took a lot of capital, and so on and so forth. I think that those days are gone. We've seen with all the social media companies and the like. But the broad category that we've defined as health and wellness, I separate from companies that go down a regulated path. So again, our common denominator in the biopharma world, where you have to go through the FDA in one way or another, versus the non-regulated. So when we talk about the health and wellness group of companies today, that's just an easy distinction, that you don't have to deal with the regulatory barriers. You're taking some different angle of attack. So a couple of things that I'll draw out just as we look at the list. So the most obvious ones are the fitness trackers that everyone still loves to hate. They say the typical consumer has them for a short period of time and gets rid of them, and so on and so forth. But I would argue that the fitness tracker, as a sector, if you will, has done a couple of things in that that group of companies have become the early indicators of teaching all of us to have a daily relationship with our data. And I watch myself as a guy that tries to maintain, relatively healthy routines. I still pay attention to my tracker, and if on a given day I'm watching some part of my behavior go a little bit out of kilter, it draws me back in. And so Leslie Saxon tomorrow morning will talk about that very point, about how we're moving the relationship between the consumer and their awareness of their data and linking into the traditional system. So against that backdrop, let's just talk quickly. I put Fitbit and Jawbone in maybe one kind of broad category, and we've all watched the Fitbit IPO and the like. But I'd also use two other examples of early exits, one of which I know was a nice success for the venture community because I was involved, and another I don't know that the details were published, but it's Misfit and Myfitnesspal. And what each of those companies, to me, represent is, in the case of Misfit, it's, you could argue they were an elegant tracker with some basic themes that they developed around why they were different from the Fitbits and the other more dominant players. But they found a niche, and they found a very nice exit into a watch company, Fossil, that was really trying to bring their consumer-facing product with a new twist. And so they're bringing that sort of depth of technology that's been developed and bringing that in-house. In a similar way, I would say Myfitnesspal, which is one of the early fitness apps for tracking, and people are sometimes critical of the apps because they say they're just kind of one-off, they're not really going to get scale and what have you. And that company was acquired by Under Armour. So again, an unlikely, I'll call it an imposter in the field, that's an athletic wear company, but yet anyone who's paid any attention to Under Armour has witnessed that they are very focused on moving to the next step in the dimension of the way in which people think about their relationship with their athletic wear, if you will. So that said, I would say as an investor, Bryan, those are pretty crowded fields. A lot of bets have been made. As you sit today, maybe two perspectives, the back perspective of how it's looked over the last few years, and maybe if you're seeing a deal come forward today, if there's anything that could possibly be interesting in those broad categories of sensors and tracking.
I hope sensors and tracking gets more interesting. We have not invested in that space. We've had a hard time with sort of the consumer hardware space. You have to have very good product yields and COGS in order to hit the price points that you can sell these things at. It's been unclear to us what the length of sort of uniqueness and differentiation is. We end up trying to focus our efforts on, colloquially we call it businesses that matter, but ones that will be sustainable, substantial businesses over time. With apologies to anybody who's in the audience in the wearable space, like I kind of look at wearables almost like the gaming companies that have gone public. Like you can have a hit product, but I think it's very hard to continue that over time. I hope that there will be some set of almost therables, I guess, wearables that will actually provide some greater medical benefit than sort of just a consumer product over time, and that it'll actually be the data and the health or wellness or medical improvements that come out of that will make that interesting as a longer time frame business for us.
Right. So we'll come. I want to get back to our main theme here, but just on picking up on that for a moment. So the good example that jumps to my mind, and there are several, are the therables, if you will, that have gone through the FDA-regulated process. And so AliveCore would be a good example of a cardiology product that is a FDA-cleared gadget, if you will, that allows you to get real-time reads on your cardiovascular EKG. My observation of that company, and I'm not directly involved, although I have a lot of friends, is that has been a great technology, and now they're going through the process of really defining their business model. And I just would make that as an observation. But let me get back to our main theme, which would be with the gadgets, if you will, and we'll just use Fitbit. I don't think either one of us have an involvement with Fitbit, so as a public company, we can just observe from the outside looking in. I would maybe compare and contrast. Back in the .com early days, people would have perhaps looked at Amazon and said, who's going to worry about shipping books over the internet? And Amazon, as an early entrant and early leader, has now become obviously very dominant. Would you say that the future of Fitbit is likely to be robust because they got out, they raised capital, they've got visibility, they're being advertised? Or do you think it's, when we look back 5 years from now, it'll have been eclipsed by therables, if you will?
Amazon would not have been my first analogy for Fitbit. They dealt with low margins early on, but they were essentially a pass-through.
The channel,
right?
Fair enough.
I think that if Fitbit evolves to more of a software and data strategy, then I think there's probably something interesting there. I think if it relies on continuous upgrade cycles of new standalone hardware pieces, I think that's going to be harder. I think all of us are going to have a phone that will basically be implanted in our brain, right? And a bunch of people will have an Apple Watch, so that it's a question of how many different pieces of hardware does one need. I think there are some interesting businesses that have gotten started up that have left aside the hardware component and really been trying to deal with the leverage and efficiencies of the software and data.
So we've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to move forward. But maybe before we leave this slide, any of the three companies that you're invested in here that you'd like to comment on in particular?
No, I just comment sort of on health and wellness generally, which is, I think that, as you noted, the healthcare industry is rife with constituencies that have small margins, or if you're an employer, healthcare is simply a cost center. And finding near-term, very tangible ROIs is super important in order to get any real traction and uptake of a product for a new company. And the sort of generalized health and wellness space has been one that has been sort of a fad these days for benefits managers at big, large self-insured employers. But without a real ROI, you don't ever get $1 million clients. You get sort of $100,000 clients. And that's a tough way to build a business over time. So I would just encourage people to make sure they find very near-term tangible ROIs.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's actually a great segue to our next slide, which puts us in many ways right in the center of the healthcare system. And so as people have talked about broadly, where will digital health make an impact? The overarching comment is that our healthcare system is in big trouble. All the things that we know about that need not be said. But there also are comments that it's one of the first industries that really has not yet been fully tech-enabled. And I think your early work with Athena Health is probably a good starting point because you were one of the pioneers there. But if we think of 2016 and beyond, we're dealing with these very complex, dispersed, fragmented industries, whether it's the providers or the payers, but yet people are going in and trying to develop business models and business cases around how to make some aspect of the clinical workflow more efficient. And so in that broad category, you might start, because I think Athena Health was truly one of the pioneers. Talk a little bit about what the world looked like when you were involved in the early days of Athena Health, which was very different, but not that long ago. And then maybe just a general comment on this category.
Sure. Yeah. It was like horse and buggy,
Yeah.
but so there's just no comparison. Like when Athena got started, in the first quarter, I think we were trying to do a deal with New England Bell, which doesn't exist anymore, in order to get high-speed internet access into doctors' offices, which is also not a problem anymore. Right? So it's just a whole different world.
And what year was that?
99.
Yeah.
If you can come up with a very hard ROI valuable product for the world that provides healthcare, right? Providers, health systems, hospitals, all that sort of thing. Sales cycles are long, but churn rates are super low. Like you never leave because you're dealing, like these hospitals all have anywhere between large negative net margins and like a couple of points of net margin. So they're all about like, how do I drop more money to the bottom line of my business that is sort of staying afloat, right? And coming under a variety of price pressures in various ways. Even though these are large enterprises, they've been cobbled together, right? Sort of, like someone built a little house and then made it into a mansion with like 43 add-ons or something. Yep. And so you have wonderfully high quality, terrific health systems that have 4 EHRs and like 30 practice management systems in them. And like they can't talk to each other. It's totally insane, right? And most of these big health systems have been trying to essentially increase their lead gen or marketing funnel of patients, which is sort of how they think about, right? I mean, their goal in life, in all honesty, from a financial perspective, is to put bodies in beds, right? And so they've been out buying primary care docs and people out in the community sort of to get that catchment area and get all those patients, and yet they haven't tied those docs in, yeah, right, on their IT systems and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of good stuff to do there. Kairos is investment we've done, which essentially just helps match patients and physicians. Like something like 25% of patients who call into a hospital looking for an appointment leave that phone call without an appointment, right? Like it's crazy.
Step one,
right?
Get
So
them
exactly,
in the door.
like,
Yeah.
Give me a break. And some of it is because they, health systems, like, they send you to the wrong doc. They send you to the shoulder orthopedist, not the knee orthopedist. Or, oh, no, I have to see the head of cardiology. Well, that person is 16 weeks out. Okay, well, I can't wait that long. Like, it's such simply a data algorithm knowledge perspective. There's lots of low-hanging fruit there, but you have to know that you're dealing with an organization that has a bunch of cross currents in it in order to get installed.
So against that backdrop where you think of Venrock as one of your sort of basic premises of what you've done so well for so long is that you want to do things that matter and that are at scale, so you're not looking at point solutions. And if we look at, we're in 2016, so let's look 2016 forward. Let me just posit an example and see if I'm thinking about it the right way. So I'm looking at the hospital systems as all consolidating, and we see that happening. One of the places where I spend some of my time is I'm the chair of this thing called the Digital Health Vision Council for a group that includes the Adventist healthcare system. And I've been extraordinarily impressed, and as I've come to think clumsily about the provider community, there's probably the top 10 systems in the country by revenue, and the Adventist is among them at 15 billion or something. And they are in Florida Hospital is where I have my direct contact. They are an extraordinarily disciplined, well-run organization, even though they do represent kind of the Winchester house of cobbled things together, but they're now kind of cobbled together. And they drop a very substantial bottom line out of that multi-billion-dollar top line every year. And they try and be strategic, and they try and be thoughtful about where they make their investments. So if I'm in your chair, it would seem to me that those kinds of payers or consumers, if you will, of whatever Venrock is going to invest in, make it a little more interesting as you look 2016 forward than maybe it had been when you were, to use the Athena Health example, you're really the pioneer trying to get a dial-up into a doctor's office. So would you see it as a kind of a new landscape going forward?
I think that hospitals, I don't know Adventist specifically, I think they're in for a very large sea change over the next decade. Yeah. They make more than all of their net margin off their commercial patients. Yeah. And they make probably more than all of their net margin off of stuff that they charge a lot for that you could do somewhere else. Yep. Right? Like, so you go to a doc in the hospital and you walk in, you meet with the doc, and the doc says, well, you need an x-ray. Like, go downstairs and get your x-ray. Right? There's, like, if you can take 3 steps, you should never have an x-ray done in the hospital, yeah. Right? Because it costs like 3 times as much as the imaging center around the corner from the hospital from the standalone guy, right? And so I think that, and historically, there's been no information about where to go in order to make efficient use of the healthcare system. And over the last 4 or 5 years, we've taken little baby steps in this direction, right? Like, you and I now pay more for our healthcare, not only on an ongoing basis, but for every encounter we take, right? And that's employers' efforts to make us care more about, walking half a block to go get that x-ray taken than doing it downstairs in the hospital. I think there will continue to be opportunities within hospitals and healthcare systems to sell stuff, but I think it's going to be under the backdrop of us having 30% too many hospital beds or something. Yeah. So I think actually it's going to be a rough space. Like, more interesting spaces in that realm. I think lots of hospitals are going to begin to take on insurance company risk. Yeah. And become payers and health systems. Not only, lots of them do it now for their own population, right, which sort of makes sense, but they'll do it for other populations as well, and that will drive them to want to be more efficient. Like, as soon as you're on the hook for the cost, like, you may be a doc in the hospital saying, no, go down the block to get your x-ray done, because frankly, we're not the cost competitive place to get that done. But I think it's going to be a rough space.
Yeah, and I think we're right. I mean, my observation, we're right in the middle of it. So if I look at, Kaiser is sort of the classic example of the organization that has been doing it for a long time, and is really starting to be very impactful. Sure. Florida Hospital and the Adventist system are the example that they have a multi-billion-dollar business dropping a lot of free cash flow to the bottom line, but it's all, as you said, been predominantly through commercial payers, or the classic fee-for-service. But they know, and that's part of the strategic process they're going through, they know that they're going to be looking, like Kaiser, it's going to be the value-driven business model, and so the disruption in their business right now is coming as a result of that planning flow. So the
Yeah, you
kinds
have
of
it, you have
companies-
it going on here, right? Blue Shield of California booted Stanford out of its network for a couple of its plans because Stanford wasn't cost competitive to everything else. I think Stanford never thought they'd do it.
Yeah, no, because they're Stanford. So that's maybe a good segue to where a lot of action is taking place. If we're moving now from how digital health can impact the clinical workflow in bringing efficiencies and moving away from we make money every time we send you to get an x-ray to the whole payor piece. I'd love to just, without asking questions, open broadly. You've got a couple of bets here, but there's a couple of big ones. Oscar's notable, but just the whole insurance revenue management.
We've not been enthralled with becoming an insurance company. Oscar's done a nice job. They've raised a bunch of money at terrific valuations. They've lost a lot of money as an operating business over the last couple of years. For us, insurance is a capital-intensive, low-margin, low-brand affinity business. And so that sort of kept us on the sidelines in that space. The company you have up there that we have invested in, Aledade, is an attempt to give independent primary care docs the resources, tools, technology to take risk, all right? So to transition from fee-for-service to a more longitudinal care path and to both from the government and from commercial payers go at risk for their better care. And they've been around for a couple years now and doing a quite nice job. It will be interesting to see what happens in the big health systems that have bought up all these primary care doc groups, and most of them had 2 or 3 year contracts. I think you will begin seeing a bunch of those primary care doc groups spinning back out of these big hospital systems.
Interesting. So you think they're going to find
the chops to do that? I think if given the opportunity, right, and a way to be independent without being at risk that you're going to lose your house, right? Which is I think what you have to provide those independent docs. I think a bunch of them will be happier and try to be independent, so that in any geography, right, once they're on the hook for the value that gets provided, if there are 3 hospitals in the space, you will call up all 3 hospitals and say, what's your bed rate today, right? Like I actually care.
Yeah. So that's a huge, what I would call a counter trend, because the conventional wisdom is all the docs are getting pulled up into the systems. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer that with all the things that are happening in digital health, we need to continue to rarefy and elevate the doctor, because you want the best and the brightest going into that profession. So that'll be a fun one to watch. So I want to try and save a couple minutes for questions. So let me just quickly jump over this last one, and it really doesn't deserve, I think, to be a category unto itself, but it's the whole notion of telehealth. And I've heard some of your venture colleagues say that they're staying far clear of the sector because they think it's a race to the bottom. It's hard to distinguish yourself and so on and so forth. But you've got 2 investments here, Doctor on Demand, and maybe Grand Rounds isn't really telehealth, but just any quick notions, and then why don't you open it for questions after you finish that
Sure,
question.
yeah. No, look, everybody in this room who, over the course of a year, you probably have, 2 to 10 reasons to sort of interact with the healthcare system. And you probably have 4 or 5 or 6 different ways you go about trying to access the healthcare system then, right? Like if your kid has, an eye infection, you do it one way. If your dad falls and you worry he may have broken his hip, you do it a different way, and on and on and on. There's an enormous amount of efficiency to be brought to the healthcare system if there is sort of a triage point, a front door to the healthcare system, right? Where you can immediately get an answer of maybe that solves the problem, right? Or it's like, okay, here's your next step, rather than sort of swimming around in the muck, trying to figure out, okay, where do I go? What do I do? And oftentimes when you're trying to access the healthcare system, you're not in your most rational, intelligent discovery mode, right? You're kind of panicky because you're worried something's really wrong. And to me, that's one of the real benefits of something like telehealth. It's anytime, day or night, wherever you are. You know, I had a buddy who called Doctor on Demand yesterday from Berlin, right? Like, go to another country and you're like, holy crap, what do I do if something happens?
I did it with my wife from Rome. So.
Right? And that's sort of a meta trend in it. Like, you can get down into the deeper part of, well, that's $40 and seeing a doc is 120, right? So there's actually immediately cost savings, but that to me is the smaller play in it. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up as we ask before we clap. One quick question, anybody? Right here.
I'm just a little curious about your take on Proteus Digital Health, which has raised a ton of money, but then FDA came and said they're rejecting the first digital medicine, which they partnered with Otsuka. Any thoughts on what message that might send to the digital health community?
I think the message it sends to the digital health community is the FDA is still figuring out how it wants to deal with software and technology approaches, right? The FDA for many years has been in the business of protecting patients, right? And in the same way that they've been figuring out their way through molecular diagnostics, given what's going on in genomics, I think they're still figuring out, what's safe, what's not, how are we going to go about it? Like, okay, in that case, why is Takeda, like, why do they want to do this? What's in it for them? How are they approaching it? So I would encourage anybody who is going to deal with the FDA, like, they're very open to talking these days. I just go to them and just, like, talk super early. Like, lots of people are like, oh, well, I'm not really ready to talk to the FDA. I just go talk to them, right? Because you'll get a sense, and you may find that they're actually very open to having you help form their thinking, right? Like, in the biotech space, it happened with patient-reported outcomes over the last 5 or 7 years, right? Like, there are some diseases, irritable bowel syndrome, stuff like that. There were no good endpoints for trials. And so some companies got on it early and developed the endpoint set with the FDA. I think that's going to happen in this space as well. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.